Appendix 4, Section 3 of On War, Volumes 2 and 3 by Karl von Clausewitz, translated by J. J. Graham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Guide to Tactics, Part 3. Plan of Battle, Definition. 220a. The plan of the battle makes its unity possible. Every action in common requires such unity. This unity is nothing else but the object of the combat. From it proceed the directions which require to be given to all the different parts in order to attain the object in the best way. The appointment of the object and the arrangements consequent upon it form therefore the plan. 220b. We mean here by plan everything which is prescribed respecting the battle, whether beforehand, at the commencement, or in the course of the engagement, consequently the whole operation of the intelligence on matter. 220c. But there is plainly an essential difference between such directions on the one hand, as must be and can be given previously, and those on the other hand which the exigencies of the moment require. 220d. The first constitutes the plan in the proper sense, the latter we may call the conduct of the battle. 221. As these determinations which the moment calls forth are chiefly derived from the reciprocal action of the opposing parties, we shall leave the discussion and analysis of this difference until we come to the subject of the reciprocal action. 222. A part of the plan lies ready-made in the formation, tactical organisation, of the combatant forces, by which the great number of parts is reduced to a few. 223. In a partial combat, this formation is a thing of more consequence than in the total combat. In the former it often constitutes the whole plan, and the smaller the body, the more this will be the case. A battalion in a great battle does not use many other dispositions than those prescribed by the regulations, and on the drill ground, but that is not sufficient for a division. There particular directions become more necessary. 224. But in the total combat the formation is seldom the whole plan, even for the smallest body. The plan often modifies the formation to afford scope for special dispositions. A squadron undertaking the surprise of one of the enemy's small posts divides itself into several separate parts, just as well as the largest army. Aim of the plan. 225. The object of the combat makes the unity of the plan. We may regard it as its aim, that is, the direction to which all activity should converge. 226. The object of a combat is victory, in other words, everything which is a condition of victory, and which is included in number 4. 227. None of the objects enumerated in number 4 can be attained in battle except by the destruction of the enemy's force, which therefore appears to be the means for all. 228. It is itself in most cases the principal object as well. 229. If that is the case, the plan is aimed at the greatest possible destruction of the enemy's forces. 230. When some of the things named in number 1 are of greater importance than the destruction of the enemy's force, it takes a subordinate place as a means. Then the greatest possible is no longer demanded, but only a sufficient destruction, and we may then take the nearest way to the aim. 231a. There are cases in which the points named in number 4, C, D, E, F, G, which lead to the retreat of the enemy, may be attained without any destruction of the enemy's armed forces. Then the enemy is conquered by a manoeuvre, not by a combat, but this is no victory, therefore only for use when we have something else than a victory for an object. 231b. In such cases, the employment of military force will still always imply the idea, certainly, of a combat, therefore of a destruction of the enemy's force, but only as possible, not as probable. For inasmuch as our views are aimed at something else than the destruction of the enemy's forces, we presuppose these other things to be effectual, and that they will prevent any serious opposition from taking place. If we cannot make such a presupposition, then we ought not to choose these other things for our end, and if we err in the presupposition, the plan will miss its aim. 232. From the preceding number it follows that whenever a considerable destruction of the enemy's forces is the condition of victory, it must also be the chief object of the plan. Now, as a manoeuvre is not in itself a combat, but a combat takes place if a manoeuvre does not succeed, therefore neither can the rules which apply to total combat suit the case of a manoeuvre, and the particular things which are efficacious in a manoeuvre can contribute nothing to the theory of the combat. 234. Many mixed relations certainly arise in practice, but there is no reason against separating things in theory which in themselves are essentially different. If we know the nature of each part, then the combination of them may easily be made. 235. The destruction of the enemy's armed force is therefore in all cases the aim, and the things named in number 4, B, C, D, E, F, are first called forth by it, but then certainly enter into reciprocal action with it as powers in themselves. 236. Such of these things as perpetually recur, that is to say, are not the consequence of special relations, ought also properly to be regarded as effects of the destruction of the enemy's forces. 237. So far, therefore, as it is possible to establish anything quite general as to the plan of a battle, it can only relate to the most effectual application of our own forces to the destruction of the enemy's. Relation between the magnitude and certainty of the result. 238. In war, and therefore, of course, in combat, we have to deal with moral forces and effects which cannot be nicely calculated. There must, consequently, always remain a great uncertainty as to the result of the means applied. 239. This is still further increased by the number of contingencies with which operations in war are brought into contact. 240. Wherever there is uncertainty, risk becomes an essential element. 241. To risk, in the ordinary acceptation, means to build upon things which are more improbable than probable. To risk in the widest sense is to suppose things which are not certain. We shall take it here in the latter sense. 242. Now, if there was in all cases a clearly defined line between probability and improbability, the idea might occur to us to make it the boundary line of risk, and hold the passing of that line as inadmissible, that is, as risk in the restricted sense of the word. 243. But in the first place such a line is a chimera, and in the next the combat is not an act of reflection only, but of passion and courage as well. These things cannot be shut out. If we should try to confine them too closely, we should divest our own powers of the most powerful springs of action in war, and involve ourselves in constant disadvantage, for in most cases the falling short of the true line, which is so unavoidable and frequent, is only compensated by our sometimes overstepping it. 244. The more favourable our presuppositions, that is to say, the greater the risk we run, so much the greater are the results which we expect by these same means, and therefore the objects which we have in view. 245. The more we risk, the less the probability and consequently the certainty of the result. 246. The greatness of the result and the certainty of it stand therefore in opposition to each other when the means given are the same. 247. The first question now is, how much value we should put upon one or other of these two opposite principles. 248. Upon this nothing general can be laid down. On the contrary, of all questions in war, it is the one most dependent on the particular circumstances in each case. In the first place, it is determined by relations which, in many cases, oblige us to run the greatest risks. Secondly, the spirit of enterprise and courage are things purely subjective, which cannot be prescribed. We can require of a commander that he should judge of his means and relations with professional knowledge, and not overestimate their effects. If he does this, then we must trust to him to turn his means to the best advantage with the aid of his courage. Relation between the magnitude of the result and the price. 249. The second question in relation to the destruction of the enemy's forces concerns the price to be paid for it. 250. With the intention of destroying the enemy's forces is certainly in general included the idea of destroying more than we shall in turn sacrifice on our own part. But this is by no means a necessary condition, for there may be cases, for instance when we have a great superiority in numbers, when the mere diminution of the enemy's forces is an advantage, even if we pay for it by the greater loss on our own side. 251. But even if we aim decidedly at destroying more of the enemy's force than we sacrifice on our own side, still there always remains the question of how great is the sacrifice to be, for according to it the chance of the result naturally rises and falls. 252. We readily perceive that the answer to this question depends on the value which we place on our forces. therefore on individual interests. To these interests the decision must be left, and we can neither say that it is a rule to spare our own troops as much as possible, or to make a lavish use of them. Determination of the nature of combat for the separate parts, corps, etc. 253. The plan of the battle fixes for each single division where, when, and how it is to fight, that is, it fixes time, place, and form of the combat. 254. Here, as well as everywhere, the general relations, that is, those proceeding from the abstract idea, are to be distinguished from those which the particular case brings with it. 255. The manifold diversity in plans of battles must naturally proceed from the special relations in each case, because when the special advantages and disadvantages are sought for and discovered, the former are brought into use and the latter are neutralised. 256. But the general relations also give certain results, and although few in number and simple in form, still they are very important, because they belong to the very essence of the thing, and constitute the basis in all other decisions. Attack and defence. 257. In regard to the nature of the combat, there are only two distinctions which always appear and are therefore general. The first arises from the positive or negative intention, and is the distinction between the attack or defence. The other arises from the nature of arms, and is the distinction between the fire combat and close combat. 258. In the strictest sense, defence should only be the warding off of a blow, and should therefore require no other weapon than a shield. 259. But that would be a pure negation, a state absolutely passive, and making war is anything but patient endurance. The idea of thorough passivity can therefore never be laid at the root of defence. 260. Strictly considered, firearms, the most passive of weapons, have still something positive and active in their nature. Now, the defence makes use in general of the same weapons and also of the same forms of combat as the attack, both in fire and close combat. 261. The defence is therefore to be considered a contest just as much as the attack. 262. The object of this contest can be nothing but victory, which is therefore just as much an object for the defence as for the attack. 263. There is nothing to justify the conception of the defender's victory being something negative. If somewhat like it in certain cases, that lies in particular conditions. In the conception of the defence, that notion must not enter, otherwise it reacts logically on the whole idea of combat, and introduces into it contradictions, or leads back again by strict deduction to that absurdity, a state of absolute endurance and sufferance. 264. And yet there is a difference between attack and defence, which, while it is one only in principle, is also a very essential one. It is that the assailant wills the action, the combat, and calls it into life, whilst the defender waits for it. 265. This principle runs through all war, therefore through the whole province of combat, and in it all differences between attack and defence have their origin. 266. But whoever wills an action must aim at something thereby, and this object must be something positive, because the intention that nothing should be done could call forth no action. The offensive must therefore have a positive object. 267. Victory cannot be this object, for it is only a means. Even in a case where victory is sought entirely on account of itself, on account of the mere honour of arms, or to influence the political negotiations by its moral weight, still that effect, and not the victory itself, is always the object. 268. The defender, just as well as the aggressor, must have victory in view, but in each the desire springs from a different source. In the offensive, from the object which the victory is to serve; in the defender, from the mere fact of the combat. The one looks down upon it, as it were, from a higher standpoint, the other looks up to it from a lower position. Whoever fights can only fight for the victory. 269. Now, why does the defender fight? That is, why does he accept the combat? Because he will not concede the positive object of the offensive, or in other words, because he wants to maintain the status quo. This is the primary and necessary object of the defender. Whatever further may attach itself to this is not necessary. 270. The necessary intention of the defender, or rather the necessary part of the defender's intention, is therefore negative. 271a. Wherever there is this negativity on the part of the defender, that is, wherever and whenever it is in his interest that nothing should be done, but that things should remain as they are, he is thereby enjoined not to act, but to wait until his opponent acts. But the moment that the latter acts, the defender can no longer attain his object by waiting and not acting. He therefore now acts just as well as his opponent, and the difference ceases. 271b. If we apply this in the first place to the whole combat only, then all difference between attack and defence will consist in this, that the one waits for the other, but the force of the actual combat will not be further influenced by it. 272. But this principle of the defence may also be applied to partial combats. It may be for the interest of corps or parts of an army that no change should take place, and in that way they may also be led to adopt the expectative. 273. This is not only possible as regards branches and corps on the side of the defender, but also as respects those on the side of the assailant. It takes place in reality on both sides. 274. It is natural, however, that it should occur more frequently in the case of the defender than in that of the assailant, but this can only be shown when the particular circumstances in connection with the defensive principle come under consideration. 275. The more we imagine the defensive principle descending to the smallest branches in a total combat, and the more generally it is diffused through all the branches, so much the more passive becomes the whole resistance, so much the more the defence approaches to that point of absolute endurance which we look upon as an absurdity. 276. The point in this direction at which the advantage to the defender of waiting ceases, that is, the point where its efficacy is exhausted, where, to a certain extent, it is satiated, we shall only be able to examine closely hereafter. 277. For the present, all that we deduce from what has been said is that the offensive or defensive intention not only determines something as to the commencement of the combat, but may also pervade its whole course, that by that means there are therefore in reality two different kinds of combats. 278. The plan of the combat must therefore determine in every case whether as a whole it is to be an offensive or defensive combat. 279. It must also determine this point for those corps which have been assigned to them a mission different from that of the general body. 280. If we now leave out of consideration for the present every particular circumstance which might decide the choice of attack and defence, then there is only one rule which presents itself, namely, that when we wish to defer the solution we must act defensively, when we seek it offensively. 281. We shall see this principle come into connection presently with another which will make it plainer. Fire combat and close combat. 282. The plan of the combat must further determine the choice of the form of combat in its relation to arms, that is, fire combat and close combat. 283. But these forms are not so much branches of combat as essential elements of it. They result from the armament, they belong to each other, and only by the combination of the two together can the full power of the combat be developed. 284. The truth of this view, which otherwise is not absolute but only approximative, comprehending the majority of cases, shows itself by the combination of arms in the hands of one combatant, and by the intimate union of different kinds of troops which has become a necessity. 285. But a separation of these two elements, and the use of the one without the other, is not only possible but very frequently happens. 286. In respect to the mutual relations of the two, and their natural order, among themselves, the plan of the battle has nothing to determine, as these are determined already by conception, by the formation, tactical organisation, and the drill ground, and therefore, like the formation, belong to the stereotypic part of the plan. 287. As to the use of these two forms of combat apart from each other, there is no general rule, unless this can pass for such, that such separation must always be regarded as a necessary evil, that is, as a less effective form of action. All cases in which we are obliged to make use of this weaker form belong to the domain of particular circumstances. Occasions for the use of the bayonet alone, such, for instance, as the execution of a surprise, or when there is no time to use firearms, or if we are sure of a great superiority of courage on our side, are plainly only isolated cases. Determination of time and place. 288. As to the determination of time and place, we have in the first place to observe in reference to these two things, that in the total combat the determination of place belongs to the defence alone, the determination of time to the attack. 289. But for partial combats, the plan either of an offensive or of a defensive combat has to give determinations respecting both. Time. 290. The appointment of time for a partial combat, which seems at first sight only to affect the subject at most in a few points, takes however a different turn on closer examination, and is seen to penetrate it through and through with a ruling idea, decisive in the highest degree, that is, the possibility of a successive use of forces. 291. Simultaneous action is, in itself, a fundamental condition of the common action of separate forces. This is also the case in war, and particularly in the combat, for as the number of the combatants is a factor in the product of the same, therefore, ceteris paribus, the simultaneous application of all our forces, that is, the greatest assemblage of them in time against an enemy who does not employ all his at once, will give the victory, certainly in the first instance only, over the part of the enemy's force which has been employed. But as this victory over a part of the enemy's force raises the moral force of the conqueror and lowers that of the vanquished, it follows, therefore, that although the loss of physical force may be equal on both sides, still this partial victory has the effect of raising the total forces of the conqueror and diminishing those of the vanquished, and that consequently it may determine the result of the total combat. 292. But the deduction drawn in the preceding number supposes two conditions which do not exist. In the first place, that the number of troops must have no maximum, and secondly, that the use of one and the same force has no limits as long as there is anything left of it. 293. As regards the first of these points, the number of combatants is limited at once by space, for all that cannot be brought into actual use are superfluous. By it the depth and extent of the formation of all combatants intended to act simultaneously is limited, and consequently the number of combatants. 294. But a much more important limitation of numbers lies in the nature of the fire combat. We have seen, number 89c, that in it, within certain limits, the increase of number has only the effect of raising the strength of the fire combat on both sides, that is, its total effects. Now, this increased effect, when it brings no advantage in itself for one side, ceases then to be of service to that side. It therefore easily reaches a maximum in that case. 295. This maximum determines itself entirely by the individual case, by the ground, the moral relations between the opposing troops, and the more immediate object of the fire combat. Here it is enough to say that there is such a thing. 296. The number of troops to be employed simultaneously has therefore a maximum beyond which a waste takes place. 297. In the same way, the use of one and the same body of troops has its limits. We have seen, in number 123, how troops under fire gradually become unserviceable, but there is likewise a deterioration in close combat. The exhaustion of physical force is less there than in fire combat, but the moral effect produced by an unsuccessful issue is infinitely greater. 298. Through this deterioration, which forces used in action suffer, including as well those not actually engaged, a new principle comes into the combat, which is the inherent superiority of fresh troops opposed to those already used. 299. There is still a second subject for consideration, which consists in a temporary deterioration of forces that have been engaged in the crisis which occurs in every action. 300. The close combat in practice may be said to have no duration. In the moment that the shock takes place between two cavalry regiments, the thing is decided, and the few seconds of actual sword fight are of no consequence as regards time. It is very much the same with infantry and with large masses, but the affair is not then finished on that account. The state of crisis which has burst out with the decision is not yet quite over. The victorious regiment pursuing the vanquished at full speed is not the same regiment lately drawn up on the field of battle in perfect order. Its moral force is certainly intensified, but as a rule its physical force, as well as that resulting from military order in its ranks, have suffered. It is only by the loss which his adversary has suffered in moral strength, and by the circumstance that he is just as much disordered, that the conqueror retains his superiority. Therefore, if a new adversary makes his appearance, with his moral force intact and his ranks in perfect order, There can be no question that, supposing the troops equally good, he will beat the conqueror. 301. A similar crisis takes place in the fire combat to such a degree that the side which has just been victorious by its fire and has driven back its enemy still finds itself for the moment in a decidedly weakened condition as respects order in its ranks and physical and moral force, a condition which lasts until all that has been thrown into disorder is once more restored to its normal relations. 302. What we have said here of smaller divisions holds good with respect to larger ones as well. 303. The crisis is in itself greater in smaller divisions because it has an effect uniformly throughout the whole, but it is of shorter duration. 304. The weakest is a general crisis, especially of a whole army, but it lasts the longest in large armies, often for several hours. 305. As long as the conqueror is in the crisis of the combat, the conquered has, in that crisis, a means of still restoring the combat, that is, of turning its result, if he can bring forward fresh troops in sufficient numbers. 306. In this manner, therefore, the successive employment of troops is introduced in a second way, as an efficacious principle. 307. But if the successive employment of troops in a series of combats following one after another is possible, and if the simultaneous use is not unlimited, then it follows of itself that the forces which cannot be efficacious in simultaneous action may become so in successive. 308. By this series of partial combats, one after another, the duration of the whole combat is considerably extended. 309. This duration now brings into view a fresh motive for the successive use of forces, by introducing a new quantity into the calculation, which is the unforeseen event. 310. If in general a successive use of troops is possible, then it follows that we can no longer know how the enemy will employ his, for only that portion which is brought into action at once comes within the scope of our observation, the rest does not, and therefore we can only form some general conjectures respecting it. 311. By the mere duration of the action, there is brought into our reckoning an increased amount of pure chance, and that element naturally plays a more important part in war than anywhere else. 312. Unforeseen events require a general system of precaution, and this can consist in nothing else than placing in rear a proportionate force, which is the reserve, properly speaking. Depth of the order of battle. 313. All battles which are fought by bodies of troops in succession require, from their very nature, that fresh troops should be forthcoming. These may either be quite fresh, that is, troops which have not been engaged at all, or such as have been in action, but by rest have recovered more or less from their exhaustion. It is easy to see that this gives room for many shades of difference. 314. Both the use of quite fresh troops, as well as the use of such as have been refreshed themselves, supposes that they have been in rear, that is, in a position beyond the region of destruction. 315. This also has its degrees, for the region of destruction does not end at once, but decreases gradually, until at last it ends entirely. 316. The range of small arms and of grape are well-defined gradations. 317. The further a body of troops is posted in rear, the fresher they will be when brought into action. 318. But no body of troops which has been within reach of an effective fire of small arms or of grape can be considered fresh. 319. We have therefore three reasons for keeping a certain number of troops in rear. They serve (a) to relieve or reinforce exhausted troops, especially in fire combat; (b) to profit by the crisis in which the conqueror is placed directly after his success; (c) as a provision against unforeseen events. 320. All troops kept back come under these categories, whatever arm they belong to, whether we call them a second line or reserve, whether they are part of a division or of the whole. End of Appendix 4, Part 3. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia.